They call him the Iron Wolf, king of 7 territories, the most powerful alpha-breathing air on this continent. But power does not stop a curse from eating you alive. Kalor Voss is dying, and the only thing standing between his empire and civil war is a contract worth $80,000, and a woman who was never supposed to matter. This is not a love story. This is a war story disguised as one. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, and drop the name of your city in the comments so I know where my people are watching from tonight. Parasit. The auction house on Greymarsh Street did not look like a place where lives were sold. It looked like a place where rats came to die. Water stains crawled down the plaster walls in shapes that resembled old maps of territories nobody remembered. The chandelier overhead had lost half its crystals, and the ones remaining caught the gaslight in a way that made the whole room look jaundiced and sick. 3 men in dark wool coats sat behind a long oak table. They did not introduce themselves. They did not need to. Sarah Calloway stood at the far end of the room with her hands clasped in front of her dress, her knuckles white, the tendons in her wrists straining against skin that had gone pale from weeks of poor sleep and worse meals. She was 23 years old. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. Her shoes pinched at the heel where the leather had cracked, and she could feel a blister forming on the back of her left ankle, raw and hot and insistent, a small, stupid pain that somehow cut through the enormous one sitting like a stone behind her ribs. Her stepmother Vivian stood 6 feet to her right, smelling of jasmine perfume and cold ambition. "The terms are simple," Vivian said. She did not look at Sarah when she spoke. She looked at the men behind the table. "The Calloway estate carries debts exceeding 400,000. The girl's biological value as an unmated omega from a noble bloodline is the last remaining asset. I am authorized to negotiate on behalf of the estate." One of the men shifted papers. "And the girl agrees?" "The girl is standing right here," Sarah said. The room went quiet. Vivian's jaw tightened. "She agrees," Vivian said. Sarah turned her head slowly and looked at her stepmother with the kind of stillness that only comes from having already screamed yourself empty in a locked room at 3 in the morning. "You could at least let me answer for myself. Seeing as I am the product." "You are not a product. You are fulfilling a contractual obligation." "Those are the same thing, Vivian. You just picked the version that lets you sleep." Vivian's nostrils flared. She smoothed the front of her coat. "Your father left this family in ruin. Every creditor in 3 territories is circling. If you have a better solution, by all means." Sarah did not have a better solution. That was the problem with being trapped. You did not need someone to explain the walls to you. You could feel them with your hands in the dark. "Who is the buyer?" Sarah asked the men at the table. They exchanged glances. The one in the center, older, with gray stubble and a scar that split his left eyebrow in 2, cleared his throat. "The identity of the contracting party is confidential until the agreement is finalized. I am signing my body into someone else's legal possession, and you will not tell me whose bed I am walking into?" "It is not that kind of contract. Every contract like this is that kind of contract. The only difference is whether someone bothers to lie about it first." The scarred man studied her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of grim recognition, the way a hunter looks at an animal that bares its teeth even after the trap has already closed. "You will be told everything you need to know once the papers are signed." "And if I refuse?" Vivian stepped forward. "Then the estate collapses by the end of the month." The creditors seize the land, the house, the name. Everything your father built disappears, and you walk away with nothing but that self-righteous mouth of yours. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Sarah felt them hit the base of her throat, right at the spot where grief and rage lived so close together she could not always tell which one was breathing. Her father had been dead 11 months. 11 months of watching Vivian strip the house down to its bones. 11 months of forged signatures and redirected funds and whispered meetings with men who smelled like cigar smoke and interest rates. 11 months of Sarah screaming into the void of a legal system that did not care about the daughter of a bankrupt lord unless she came bearing proof she could not afford to obtain. She looked at the contract on the table. $80,000. That was her price. Less than a warship, more than a horse, somewhere in the middle of a life and a transaction. She picked up the pen. "For the record," she said quietly, I am not doing this for the estate. I am doing this because the alternative is watching my father's name rot while the woman who helped destroy it wears his ring at dinner parties. She signed. Vivian did not blink. The men collected the papers. The one with the scar slid a sealed envelope across the table. A carriage will arrive at the Calloway residence in 4 days. Pack lightly. You are traveling north. How far north? Vesper Crown. The name hit the room like a dropped blade. Even Vivian went still. Vesper Crown, capital of the Iron Wolf Dominion. Seat of the most powerful alpha territory on the continent. A frozen harbor city built on volcanic rock and wolf blood, where the wind came off the northern sea so cold it could split stone and the palace rose from the cliffs like something carved out of a nightmare. You sold me to the Iron Wolf Dominion, Sarah said. Her voice did not shake, but something behind it did. Vivian recovered first. I secured the best possible arrangement given the circumstances. You sold me to Kaelor Voss. I sold the contract. What happens after that is between you and the crown. Sarah stared at her stepmother for a long time, long enough that the gaslight flickered and one of the men coughed into his sleeve. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her cracked shoes clicking against the warped floorboards, the blister on her ankle screaming with every step. And she did not look back because looking back was something you did when you still believed the people behind you might call your name. Nobody called her name. The carriage arrived on schedule. Sarah climbed in carrying one bag and wearing her mother's locket and nothing else of value. The driver was a broad-shouldered man with a face like a closed fist who said exactly 4 words to her during the entire 3-day journey north. We stop at dark. The landscape changed as they traveled. The rolling green hills of the southern territories gave way to forests so dense the canopy blocked the sky. Then the forest thinned and the ground hardened and the air turned sharp enough to taste, metallic and ancient. And the first snow began falling somewhere around the second night, small dry flakes that hit the carriage windows like whispered warnings. Sarah watched it all through glass smeared with road grime and condensation. She did not cry. She had done that already, alone in her father's study on the last night, sitting in his chair with her forehead pressed against his desk, where the wood still smelled faintly of ink and tobacco, and the particular loneliness of a good man who trusted the wrong woman. Survival was not about strength. Sarah had learned that early. Survival was about deciding which parts of yourself you were willing to let go numb so the rest of you could keep functioning. You froze the grief. You boxed the rage. You let the practical mind take the wheel, and you did not look at the rear view because the rear view was full of things that would drop you to your knees if you stared too long. She arrived at Vesper Crown on the morning of the 4th day. The city rose from the cliffs like a dark crown pressed into the skull of the earth. Black stone buildings climbed the slopes in staggered rows, their windows reflecting the gray winter light. The harbor stretched below, choked with warships and merchant vessels, and beyond it the northern sea rolled in waves the color of gunmetal. The palace sat at the highest point, an obsidian fortress with towers that disappeared into low-hanging clouds, its walls lined with iron wolf banners that snapped in the wind like the tails of angry beasts. The gates opened without ceremony. No one greeted her. A servant led her through corridors so long and cold that her breath came out in visible clouds. The stone floors were polished to a dark mirror sheen. Torches burned in iron brackets, but they gave more shadow than light. And the walls were lined with portraits of past Alpha Kings, whose painted eyes followed her with the dead certainty of men who had never once questioned their right to rule. The servant stopped before a heavy wooden door and pushed it open. Inside was a room, decent-sized, a bed with thick furs, a fireplace already lit, a window overlooking the frozen harbor. On the table sat a tray of food, simple but warm, bread and stew and dark ale. "You will stay here tonight," the servant said. "The king's steward will summon you in the morning." "When do I meet the king?" "When the king decides you are worth meeting." The door closed. Sarah stood alone in the room. The fire crackled. The wind howled against the window glass. She set her bag down, crossed to the table, and ate the stew standing up because sitting down felt like accepting that this room was hers, and she was not ready for that yet. The next morning came hard and gray. Sarah dressed in the only presentable clothes she had left, a dark wool dress that had belonged to her mother, and followed a different servant through a labyrinth of corridors until they reached a set of double doors carved with wolves. The servant knocked twice, then opened the doors and stepped aside. The throne room was enormous, vaulted ceilings supported by columns of black stone. Wolf pelts hung from iron rods along the walls. At the far end, elevated on a platform of dark granite, sat an empty throne made of welded iron, jagged and unpolished, built to look as uncomfortable as the power it represented. But the king was not on his throne. He was standing by the window to the left, his back to the room, one hand braced against the stone frame. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than any man Sarah had seen outside of a fighting ring. His dark hair was cut close, and the back of his neck showed a scar that ran from below his ear to his collar, old and silver and deliberate, the kind of wound someone gives you when they want you to remember who put you on the ground. "Close the door," he said. His voice carried without effort, deep and rough, like something dragged across gravel. The servant closed the door. Sarah stood alone in the room with the king of the Iron Wolf Dominion. He turned. The first thing she noticed was that he did not look like a king. He looked like a man who had been a king for too long. His face was hard, all jaw and cheekbone, but the skin beneath his eyes was dark, bruised with exhaustion. His eyes were the color of winter slate, sharp and assessing, but deep in them sat something Sarah recognized immediately because she had seen it in her own mirror for the past 11 months. Fatigue. The bone-deep kind that sleep cannot fix because the thing exhausting you is not physical. It is the weight of holding something together that wants to come apart. "Sarah Calloway," he said. Not a question. "King Kalor. You are younger than the file suggested. You are more tired than the legends suggest." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, surprise. The faintest ghost of it, there and gone like a match struck in wind. "Sit," he said. There were no chairs near the throne. He gestured to a heavy oak table against the wall, surrounded by high-backed seats carved with wolf motifs. Sarah sat. He did not. He paced. Slowly. His movements were controlled but not quite fluid. She watched the way he favored his left side, a slight shift in weight distribution that most people would miss unless they had spent years watching powerful men pretend they were not in pain. "You signed the contract," he said. "I did." "You understand what it requires." "I understand I am here to be your mate on paper, a legal arrangement, a signature to satisfy whatever political requirement is pressing on your throne. And you are comfortable with that." Comfortable is not the word I would use for anything that has happened to me in the last year. But I am here. That should tell you enough. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. The full force of an Alpha King's gaze was something Sarah had only heard described in cautionary tales told to young Omegas. It was supposed to buckle your knees, silence your voice, make you small. She did not feel small, she felt seen, and that was worse. "You have questions," he said. "I have about 600, but I will start with one. Why me?" He moved to the table and sat across from her. Up close, the exhaustion was even more visible. A faint tremor ran through his left hand when he laid it flat on the wood. He noticed her noticing and withdrew it. "Your bloodline is noble but disgraced. That makes you politically invisible. No rival house will see you as a threat. No alliance will feel disrupted. You are, for all practical purposes, a ghost with a signature. So you needed someone no one would care about. I needed someone no one would weaponize." The distinction landed with unexpected precision. Sarah filed it away. "And what do I get?" 80,000 was already paid to your estate. That covers the debt. I am asking what I get. Safety, resources, access to libraries, advisors, anything the palace offers, you will want for nothing. Except freedom. The contract is 2 years. After that, you walk away with a full pardon of the Calloway debts and a settlement large enough to rebuild 10 times over. And if I want to leave before 2 years, then you forfeit everything. The debts return. The estate falls, and you go back to being exactly what you were when your stepmother put you on the auction block. His voice did not soften when he said it. There was no cruelty in the delivery, but there was no kindness either. He was stating facts the way a general states casualty numbers. This is what happened. This is what will happen. Emotion does not enter the equation. Sarah leaned back in her chair. The wood creaked. The fire in the far hearth popped and hissed. "You need more than a signature," she said quietly. He went very still. "I read the political broadsheets on the way north. 3 territories are restless. House Draven has been stockpiling arms. House Moran has stopped sending tribute. And last month someone tried to assassinate the governor of the Eastern Reach, which means someone is testing your borders." She paused. "A king does not spend $80,000 on a piece of paper, unless the paper is the only thing keeping the wolves from his door. No pun intended." The silence that followed was thick enough to press against. Kaelor studied her. Not the way men usually studied omegas, cataloging the surface, measuring the yield. He studied her the way a man studies a locked door that just spoke to him. "Who told you about House Draven?" "Nobody told me. I can read. The supply contracts published in the Southern trade journals show a 30% increase in iron ore shipments to Draven territory over the last 6 months. That is not agricultural expansion." "You read trade journals?" "My father was a lord of a mid-tier house with enemies on 3 sides. He taught me to read everything, trust nothing, and always know where the money was moving before you knew where the armies were. Your father was bankrupt. My father was betrayed. There is a difference." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah did not flinch. She let them stand because they were true, and true things deserve to breathe even when they are ugly. Kaelor leaned forward. The tremor in his left hand was back. He pressed it flat against the table again, harder this time, knuckles whitening with the effort of holding something steady that wanted to shake. "You are more than the file suggested," he said. "The file was written by my stepmother. I would not trust her to describe the weather accurately, let alone a person." Something crossed his face then. It was not a smile. Kaelor Voss did not look like a man who remembered how to smile. But it was in the neighborhood, a loosening of the jaw, a flicker of something warm in the cold slate of his eyes. "The steward will show you to your permanent quarters. Tomorrow you will meet my senior advisor, Lord Hargrave, and the head of the palace guard. You will not leave the palace grounds without escort. Am I a guest or a prisoner? You are an investment. Investments are protected." That is a very elegant way of saying prisoner. "Welcome to Vesper Crown, Sarah Calloway." He stood. The conversation was over. But as Sarah rose and turned toward the door, he spoke again. "One more thing." She stopped. "The court will test you. They will probe for weakness. They will smile to your face and sharpen knives behind your back. Every person in this palace has an agenda, and most of those agendas involve me dying sooner rather than later." "Is that a warning?" "That is a job description." Sarah left the throne room and followed the servant through corridors that seemed even colder than before. But something had shifted. The weight in her chest was still there, the grief, the rage, the disorientation of being sold and shipped like cargo. But underneath it, something else was stirring. Not hope. She did not trust hope. Hope was a luxury for people who had not watched their lives collapse around them. It was something harder than hope. Something with teeth. Interest. The man behind that throne was not what she expected. He was sharper, more damaged, more honest than any powerful man had a right to be. And the tremor in his hand told her something the contract and the broadsheets and the legends never could. Kaelor Voss was not just a king holding an empire together. He was a man holding himself together. And he was losing. Her permanent quarters were on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, overlooking the harbor. The rooms were large, cold, beautifully furnished in dark wood and iron. A fireplace dominated the main wall. Fresh clothes hung in the wardrobe, all her size, which meant someone had measured her at some point during the journey without her knowing. The thought made her skin crawl. She was examining the view from the window when a knock came at the door. "Enter." A woman stepped in. She was perhaps 40, slender, impeccably dressed in deep blue, her auburn hair swept back in a style so precise it looked architectural. Her smile was perfect, practiced. The kind of smile that has been rehearsed in mirrors and deployed in ballrooms so many times, it has lost all connection to the muscles it engages. "Lady Calloway, I am Renara Vale, daughter of Lord Aldrich Vale of House Vale. I wanted to be the first to welcome you to the palace." "That is generous." Generosity has nothing to do with it. Curiosity, perhaps. The king has never taken a contracted mate before. You must be quite special. I must be quite available. There is a difference. Renara's smile did not waver. That told Sarah more than any words could. A genuine smile would have shifted. A real reaction would have rippled the surface. This woman's face was a mask, and the mask was bolted on. I have known Kaelor since we were children, Renara said. She drifted into the room, running a finger along the edge of a bookshelf. Our families have been bound by alliance for generations. I was expected to stand at his side. Many still expect it. Then I imagine you are not thrilled about my arrival. On the contrary, I think it is fascinating. She turned. Her eyes were green and sharp, and absolutely empty of the warmth her smile tried to project. A bankrupt lord's daughter from a disgraced house, purchased for $80,000, installed in the East Wing like a piece of furniture. There is something almost poetic about it. The poetry of the situation is not lost on me. Good. Then you understand your position. I understand that you came to this room within 2 hours of my arrival, which means you have been watching the gate. I understand that you mentioned your childhood with the king in the first minute, which means you want me to know you have history. And I understand that you called me fascinating instead of threatening, which means you have already decided I am no competition. Sarah paused. That last one is the interesting one, because people only dismiss threats they are afraid to take seriously. The room went very still. Renara's smile finally cracked, just at the edges, a hairline fracture in the porcelain. You are clever, Renara said softly. Clever women do not last long in this palace. Clever women do not last long anywhere. That is why we learn to be fast. Renara held her gaze for a 3 count, then turned and walked to the door. She paused in the threshold. Enjoy your rooms, Lady Calloway. I hope you find Vesper Crown to your liking. It is a beautiful city. Her voice dropped a register. Cold, though. The cold gets into everything here, even the things you think are protected. She left. Sarah stood alone again. The fire crackled. The wind off the harbor pushed against the window glass with a low, constant moan. She thought about what Kaelor had said. The court will test you. They will probe for weakness. That had taken approximately 2 hours. She was almost impressed. That evening, Sarah found the palace library on her own. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke to her either. She passed servants who averted their eyes and guards who tracked her with the blank professional interest of men paid to notice everything and react to nothing. The library was massive. 3 floors of books rising toward a ceiling painted with maps of the 7 territories. Iron ladders on rails, reading tables with thick candles burned to uneven stumps. The smell of old paper and dust, and something faintly metallic that seemed to permeate every room in this palace, as if the building itself was bleeding. She pulled trade records, territorial tax ledgers, council minutes from the last 5 sessions. She spread them across a table and started reading. This was what her father had taught her. When you are in a strange place and you have no power, the first thing you do is learn. Learn the systems, learn the money, learn who owes whom and why. Because knowledge is not power exactly. Knowledge is the thing that keeps you alive long enough to acquire power. She was 3 hours into the ledgers when a voice came from behind her. Most people who come to the library at night are hiding from someone. She turned. A man stood near the entrance, leaning against the doorframe. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that women probably found handsome before they noticed the calculation behind his eyes. He wore the dark uniform of the King's Inner Council, silver thread at the cuffs. Lord Hargrave? She guessed. Theron Hargrave, senior advisor to the king. We were supposed to meet tomorrow, but I heard the new acquisition was wandering the corridors and I thought I should investigate. Acquisition? That is what the council is calling you. Not to your face, obviously. Obviously. She looked back at her papers. I am reading the territorial tax records. I can see that. Why? Because no one handed me a briefing. No one explained the political landscape. No one told me anything about the empire I am now legally tethered to, so I am educating myself. Hargrave walked closer. He looked at the spread of documents with raised eyebrows. You have the last 3 years of Northern Reach tax receipts, the trade deficit reports from the Eastern Territories, and the Council's classified allocation summary from this past autumn. How did you even find that last one? It was misfiled in the agricultural subsidies section. Someone hid it, but they hid it badly. Hargrave blinked. Then he laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, genuine despite itself. You are going to be a problem, he said. I have been told. No, I mean, you are going to be a problem for the people who think you are furniture, and that is going to be very entertaining for the rest of us. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. What have you found so far? House Draven is arming. The Eastern Reach is leaking revenue through what looks like a network of shell trade companies, and someone on the council has been diverting military supply funds into a private account for at least 18 months. Hargrave's amusement faded. You got all that from ledgers? I got it from patterns. The ledgers just confirm it. He leaned back and studied her with new eyes. Not the way Kaelor had studied her, looking for what she was. Hargrave was studying her for what she could become. The king chose better than he knows, Hargrave said quietly. The king did not choose me. He purchased a contract. In this palace, those are the same thing. The only difference is whether someone bothers to lie about it first. Her own words, thrown back at her from a different mouth. She felt the corner of her lip twitch. I'm going to finish these records, she said. If you want to be useful, tell me who controls the military supply chain. That would be Lord Aldrich Vale. The name settled over her like a cold fog. Vale, Renara's father. Of course it is, Sarah murmured. Hargrave stood. Get some sleep, Lady Calloway. Tomorrow, the real performance begins. What performance? The one where the king introduces his contracted mate to a court full of wolves who would rather eat you than curtsy. You will want to be sharp for that. He left. The library was silent except for the rustle of old paper and the distant sound of wind crashing against the harbor walls. Sarah sat with the ledgers spread before her, the firelight throwing her shadow across the table in long, jagged shapes. She thought about the tremor in the king's hand, the calculation in Renara's eyes, the classified documents hidden in plain sight, the military supply chain controlled by the father of the woman who believed she was destined to be queen. She had been in Vesper Crown for less than 12 hours. She had already found the first crack in the Empire's armor, and tomorrow she would walk into a room full of people who wanted her gone, standing beside a king who was hiding the fact that he was dying, wearing a title she had purchased with her freedom, in a palace built on secrets that were starting to bleed through the walls. The wind screamed against the windows. Sarah closed the ledger. She did not sleep. The next morning, a servant arrived with a gown. Black silk lined with silver thread. Wolf motifs embroidered along the sleeves. It was beautiful, and it fit perfectly, and it felt exactly like what it was. A costume. Armor for a battle she had not chosen. Sarah dressed. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was pale, thin from months of deprivation, with dark circles under her eyes and a jaw set so tight the tendons in her neck stood out like cables. She did not look like a queen. She looked like someone who had crawled out of a wreck and was still deciding whether to lie down or start walking. She started walking. The servant led her to a hall she had not seen before, twice the size of the throne room, filled with people, hundreds of them, nobles in territorial colors, military officers in dress uniforms, ladies in gowns that cost more than the Calloway estate had been worth at the end. The noise was immense, conversations overlapping in layers of ambition and gossip and political maneuvering so dense you could almost taste it. Every head turned when Sarah walked in. Every conversation paused. She felt the weight of 500 eyes land on her like a physical force, pressing against her chest, measuring her worth in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Then Kaelor appeared at her side. She had not heard him approach. For a man his size, he moved with an unnatural silence, a predator's economy of motion. Breathe, he said, low enough that only she could hear. I am breathing. You are holding your breath and clenching your fists. That is the opposite of breathing. She forced her hands open, drew air through her nose, let it out. Better, he said. Is this the part where you introduce me? This is the part where I walk you through a room of people who want to destroy us both, and we pretend it is a party. Wonderful. Stay close. Speak only when spoken to. If anyone asks about the contract, deflect. And if they push? He looked down at her. The slate-gray eyes, the exhaustion, the scar below his ear, the faintest edge of something she could not quite name. Then show them what you showed me yesterday. That mouth of yours may be the most dangerous weapon in this palace. They walked in together. The hall swallowed them. And from across the room, standing in a circle of noble daughters wearing green and gold, Lady Renara Vale watched them with eyes that had already begun to calculate the exact cost of everything Sarah Calloway had just walked into. Behind Renara, half hidden in the crowd, a man in the uniform of the Great Council leaned toward Lord Aldrich Vale and whispered 3 words that would change the course of the empire. She found the ledgers. Lord Aldrich Vale did not move when he heard the words. He stood with his wineglass held at chest height, his thumb running a slow circle around the rim, and his face did nothing. That was the dangerous part. A man who flinches when he hears bad news is a man you can predict. A man whose face does nothing is a man who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Which ledgers? He said. Not a question, a calibration. The council officer leaned closer. The allocation records, the supply chain transfers, 18 months of diverted funds sitting on a library table with candle wax on the corners. Who showed them to her? No one. She found them herself, misfiled in agricultural subsidies. Aldrich's thumb stopped circling the glass. He took a slow sip, swallowed, set the glass on the tray of a passing servant with the mechanical precision of a man who treats every gesture as a move on a board. Then she is not furniture, he said. No, my lord. She is a problem-wearing furniture's dress. Across the hall, Sarah stood beside Kaylor as a procession of territorial lords and ladies approached to pay their respects. Each greeting followed the same pattern. A bow to the king, a measured glance at Sarah, words coated in honey that tasted like vinegar underneath. Lady Calloway, how wonderful. The king's taste in companions has certainly become more adventurous. Lady Calloway, welcome. I do hope you find the climate agreeable. Southern constitutions often struggle with our winters. Lady Calloway, what a charming dress. The silver thread is a nice touch. Almost regal. Almost. Every compliment carried a blade turned sideways. Sarah took them all with the same expression, neutral, attentive, the face of a woman cataloging threats while pretending to make conversation. Kaylor said little. He stood at her side like a wall of dark wool and barely leashed authority, and his presence alone was enough to keep the knives sheathed. But Sarah felt the effort it cost him, the way his jaw worked between greetings, the way his weight shifted to his right side when he thought no one was looking, the tremor in his left hand hidden inside his coat pocket. He was performing. The whole room was performing, and the performance was eating him alive. A break in the procession gave her 3 seconds of unobserved space. She leaned toward him without turning her head. You need to sit down, she said under her breath. I am fine. You have been favoring your right leg for the last 20 minutes, and your left hand has not come out of your pocket since we entered the room. You are not fine. You are a man standing on a cracked foundation pretending the ceiling is not bowing. His eyes cut to her, sharp, cold. The alpha command in that gaze was automatic, a reflex built from years of silencing rooms with a look. She did not look away. I am not one of your generals, she said quietly, and I am not one of your enemies. I am the person standing close enough to see what everyone else is too afraid to notice. So when I tell you that you need to sit down, I am not challenging your authority. I am trying to keep you vertical long enough to get through this. The silence between them lasted 4 heartbeats. She counted. Then he moved. Not to a chair. To the raised platform at the head of the hall where the host's table sat. He lowered himself into the central seat with the controlled precision of a man who knows that sitting down too fast will betray how badly he needs to. Sarah followed and took the seat to his left. The hall adjusted around them like water closing over a dropped stone, conversations resuming, bodies reorienting. You count heartbeats, he said after a moment. I count everything. It keeps me from screaming. That is a useful habit for someone in your position. My position being purchased property seated next to a king who is pretending his body is not failing in front of 500 people? That would be the position, yes. Then useful is an understatement. Food arrived, roasted meats and dark bread, and root vegetables and heavy sauces. Sarah ate because she needed fuel, not because she tasted any of it. Her eyes moved across the hall in systematic sweeps. She noted who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who looked at Kaylor with deference, and who looked at him the way wolves look at a pack leader who has started limping. Lord Hargrave told me you found the allocation records, Kaylor said without looking up from his plate. Hargrave talks fast for an advisor. Hargrave talks when I tell him to talk. What did you find? Military supply funds being siphoned through a series of redirected purchase orders, small amounts, spread across multiple line items designed to look like routine cost overruns. But the pattern is consistent and it runs for at least 18 months. Someone is building a war chest. And you think you know who? I know who controls the supply chain, Lord Aldrich Vale. Kaylor set his fork down. The metal clicked against the plate and the sound was sharper than it should have been, a small noise that carved a pocket of silence in the space between them. Aldrich Vale has served the crown for 30 years. 30 years is a long time to be close to power without holding it yourself. That is either loyalty or patience. And in my experience, patient men are just ambitious men with better calendars. You have been in this palace one day. I have been reading people my entire life. The location is new. The math is the same. He looked at her then. Really looked. Not the assessing glance from their first meeting. Something deeper. Something that carried weight. If you are wrong about Vale, you have just accused the most powerful lord in the dominion of treason based on your first night's reading. And if I am right? If you are right, then this empire is in more danger than I thought. And the woman I purchased for $80,000 just handed me a war I did not know was coming. You are welcome. Something shifted in his jaw. That almost smile again. The ghost of a reflex his face had forgotten how to complete. The hall continued around them. Music started. Couples moved to the floor. The performance ground on. But at the head table, between the king and his contracted mate, something had changed shape. It was not trust exactly. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford yet. It was recognition. Two people trapped in separate cages, realizing their bars were made of the same metal. The next 3 days passed in a blur of cold corridors and colder politics. Sarah requested and was granted access to the full palace archive. No one questioned it because no one believed she would find anything useful. The archive was a massive underground vault beneath the east wing, thousands of shelves holding decades of records, most of them deliberately disorganized to prevent exactly the kind of analysis Sarah was conducting. She reorganized 6 shelves in the first afternoon. By the second day, she had cross-referenced the supply chain records with territorial shipping manifests and found a second pattern. Weapons-grade iron was being shipped to a holding company in the Eastern Reach, a company that existed on paper but had no physical address, no employees, and no trade history before 18 months ago. By the third day, she had a name, Graymore Holdings, registered under a proxy signature that traced back through 3 layers of shell entities to a law office in the harbor district of Vesper Crown. The law office was retained exclusively by House Vale. She brought the findings to Hargrave first. His office was on the second floor of the north wing, a cramped room buried under papers and maps, and the particular chaos of a man who thinks faster than he files. He was standing at his desk when she entered, a cold cup of tea in one hand, and a look on his face that said he had not slept either. Graymore Holdings, she said, setting a stack of cross-referenced documents on his desk. He looked at the papers, then at her, then back at the papers. You traced the shell companies. 3 layers deep. All roads lead to a law office on Dagger Street retained by House Vale. The iron shipments match the timing of the diverted military funds almost to the week. Hargrave set his tea down. He ran both hands through his hair and exhaled through his nose the way a man exhales when the thing he feared is confirmed and he has to decide what to do about it while the building is still standing. Do you understand what you are holding? He said. Evidence of embezzlement and possible sedition by the most powerful noble house in the Dominion. You are holding a detonator, Lady Calloway. The question is whether you want to throw it or hand it to someone who knows where the walls are. I am handing it to you. What you do with it is a political decision above my pay grade. Your pay grade is contracted mate to the king. Nothing in this palace is above it. Except survival. Survival is above everything. Hargrave studied her for a long moment. Then he gathered the papers and locked them in a drawer. I will bring this to Kaelor, but not yet. Not until we understand the full scope. How much scope do you need? They are arming. They are stealing. They are preparing. Preparing for what? That is the piece we are missing. Aldrich Vale is not stupid. He would not risk everything for a supply of iron unless he believed the throne was vulnerable enough to take. The words settled over the room like frost. The curse, Sarah said. Hargrave's expression told her everything his mouth did not. The king is sick, she said. Not a question. The king is managing a condition. The king has a tremor in his left hand that gets worse under stress. He favors his right side when he stands for more than 20 minutes. His skin temperature runs cold enough that I could feel it from 2 feet away at the banquet. And his eyes have the specific kind of fatigue that comes from pain, not sleeplessness. He is not managing a condition. He is losing a fight. Hargrave said nothing. Tell me, Sarah said, or I will figure it out myself, and whatever I figure out in silence will be worse than whatever you tell me now. He pulled the chair out from his desk and sat heavily. He looked suddenly older, a man carrying a secret that has been eating through its container. The frost curse, he said. It runs in the royal bloodline. Every Voss king carries it. Most manage it through the mate bond. The bond generates enough vital energy to keep the curse dormant. But Kaelor has never bonded. He has ruled for 14 years without a mate, holding the curse at bay through sheer force of will and a pharmaceutical regimen that is becoming less effective every month. What happens when it stops working? His body temperature drops. Motor function degrades. Organ systems begin to slow. Eventually the cold reaches the heart and it stops. How long? At the current rate of decline, his physicians give him less than 2 years. But the political timeline is shorter. The Great Council can issue a leadership challenge if they believe the king is physically unfit to rule. And a leadership challenge during a period of vulnerability would be an invitation for every ambitious alpha house in the Dominion to make a move, including House Vale, especially House Vale. Sarah stood in that cramped office, surrounded by maps and papers and the smell of cold tea, and she felt the full architecture of the trap she had walked into reveal itself. This was not a marriage contract. This was not a political arrangement. This was a dying king's last gamble. A Hail Mary thrown at the edge of a cliff. The mate bond. That was what the contract was really about. Not a signature, not paperwork. The biological bond between an alpha and his mate, the thing that generates the vital energy to suppress the curse. Kaelor had purchased the possibility of a bond. He had spent $80,000 on the chance that proximity and time might ignite something his body needed to survive. And he had not told her. He should have told me, she said. He does not tell anyone. I am not anyone. I am the woman whose biology he is betting his life on. And that is exactly why he did not tell you. Because if he told you, every interaction between you would be contaminated by obligation. He did not want a mate who stayed because she felt guilty. He wanted a mate who stayed because she chose to. He did not give me a choice. He gave me a contract. In his world, that is the same thing. Then his world is broken. Yes, Hargrave said simply. It is. That is why you are here. Sarah left the office and walked. She did not know where she was going, and she did not care. Her feet carried her through corridors and down stairwells and past guards who watched her pass with blank professional eyes. The palace was a maze of stone and iron and cold air, and she moved through it like a woman swimming through dark water, her mind churning so fast her body could barely keep up. She ended up on the east battlements. The wind hit her like a fist. The harbor stretched below, gray and heaving. Ships rocked at anchor. Snow fell in diagonal slashes. The cold was brutal, immediate, the kind of cold that strips everything unnecessary from your mind and leaves you with nothing but the raw wiring of what you actually think and feel. She gripped the stone parapet and breathed. He was dying. The man who bought her was dying. and the contract she signed was not paperwork. It was a lifeline thrown by a man drowning in ice who could not bring himself to say the word help. She could leave. The contract allowed her to forfeit. Walk away. Let the debts return. Let the name collapse. Let Kalor Voss and his cursed bloodline and his crumbling empire solve their own problems while she disappeared into the southern territories with nothing but her mother's locket and her father's stubbornness. She could leave. She thought about the tremor in his hand, the way he had said "Welcome to Vesper Crown" with a voice that carried no warmth but somehow carried no malice either. The way he had looked at her when she told him about the ledgers, not surprised, not threatened, but seen, as if for the first time in years someone had spoken to him like a person instead of a crown. She thought about Renara Vale and her porcelain smile and the weapons-grade iron flowing through shell companies to destinations unknown. She thought about her father, dead 11 months, betrayed by the woman he loved, his legacy reduced to a number on an auction house table. She thought about the cold, the impossible, relentless cold of this place, pressing against everything, testing everything, finding every crack. And she made a decision. Not with her heart. Her heart was still too bruised to trust. She made it with the part of herself that her father had built, the part that read ledgers and counted heartbeats, and understood that sometimes the only way out of a burning room is through the wall. She turned from the battlements and walked back inside. She found Kalor in his study on the 4th floor. He was alone. Standing at the window again, his back to the door, his left hand hanging at his side where the tremor was visible even from across the room. The fire had burned low. The room smelled like cold stone and ink and exhaustion. "I know about the frost curse," she said. He did not turn around. "I know you are dying. I know the mate bond is the only thing that can stop it. I know the contract was never about paperwork. And I know that House Vale is stealing military funds to build a force strong enough to take the throne the moment you show weakness." Silence. "You should have told me." "Would it have changed your decision?" "It would have changed the terms." He turned. The light from the window caught his face, and she saw it clearly now, the thing the legends and the fear and the Iron Crown were all designed to hide. He was afraid. Not of death. Men like Kalor did not fear death because death was a personal problem, and personal problems ranked below the survival of the thing they had been built to protect. He was afraid of failing, of watching the empire he had held together with broken hands and a frozen heart come apart because his body surrendered before his will did. "What terms would you change?" he asked. "I am not a signature. I am not furniture. I am not an investment. If I stay as a partner, full access to intelligence, full seat at the strategy table. And you tell me the truth, all of it, every time, no matter how ugly. And in return? In return, I help you save your empire. And maybe, if this bond is real, I help you save yourself." The wind howled outside. The fire cracked. The tremor in his hand stilled for just a moment, as if something inside him had heard a sound it recognized from very far away. "You are asking to be queen," he said. "I'm asking to be useful. The title is your problem." He held her gaze. The slate-gray eyes, the scar, the exhaustion, and underneath all of it, buried so deep she almost missed it, a flicker of something raw and unguarded that lasted exactly one breath before the iron closed around it again. "Then stay," he said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Sarah nodded once, and somewhere beneath the palace, in a locked vault accessible only to members of the Great Council, Lord Aldrich Vale opened a leather case containing documents that bore the royal seal, military deployment orders for 3 territories, and a letter of challenge drafted in language so precise it could only have been written by someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time. He read the letter once. Then he signed it. The letter of challenge reached the Great Council before dawn. 7 sealed copies delivered by riders wearing no house colors, carrying no insignia, moving through the frozen streets of Vesper Crown like shadows detaching from the walls. Each copy bore the royal seal, which meant someone inside the palace had access to the king's own instruments of authority. Each copy was addressed to a sitting council member by name. Each copy contained identical language requesting a formal leadership review under Article 19 of the Dominion Charter, the provision that allowed the council to challenge a sitting monarch on grounds of physical incapacity. By the time the sun cracked the horizon and threw its weak gray light across the harbor, the political architecture of the Iron Wolf Dominion had already begun to fracture along fault lines that had been carved in secret for 18 months. Sarah learned about the letter at breakfast. She was sitting alone in the small dining room adjacent to her quarters, eating dark bread and salted fish, when Hargrave appeared in the doorway. He was not wearing his usual council uniform. He was dressed in riding clothes, mud on his boots, his face raw from wind. He had been outside the palace walls. At this hour, that meant he had been gathering intelligence from sources who could not risk being seen inside. "How bad?" Sarah said. She did not ask what happened. The look on his face made the question unnecessary. Aldrich Vale filed a formal challenge under Article 19. 7 council members received copies overnight. At least 4 are sympathetic. He needs 5 votes to force a public review. He has the 5th. Hargrave stopped in the doorway. "How do you know that?" "Because he would not have filed unless he already had the votes locked. Aldrich Vale does not gamble. He calculates. If the letter went out, the math is already done." Hargrave leaned against the doorframe and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, the professional composure was back, but the effort it took was visible in the muscles around his jaw. "The 5th vote is Lady Marin Droch, Eastern Reach representative. She has been quiet for months, but her territory has been hemorrhaging revenue through the same shell companies connected to Greymore Holdings. She is either complicit or compromised. Or both. Or both." Sarah pushed the plate aside. The food sat in her stomach like gravel. "Where is Kaylor?" "In the war room. He has been there since 3 in the morning. He is not taking it well." "Define not taking it well." "He broke a table." Sarah stood. She moved past Hargrave into the corridor and walked fast, her shoes striking the stone floors with a rhythm that matched her pulse. The palace was waking around her. Servants moved in their usual patterns, but there was something different in the air, a tightness, as if the building itself could feel the change in pressure. News traveled through palaces the way blood travels through a wound, fast, warm, impossible to contain once the cut was made. The war room was on the ground floor of the north wing, behind a set of iron-reinforced doors guarded by 2 men who looked like they had been carved from the same stone as the walls. They let her pass without a word. Kaylor had apparently given orders regarding her access. That fact registered somewhere in the back of her mind, and she filed it away because even small concessions from a man like Kaylor carried weight. The room inside was large, dominated by a massive oak table covered with territorial maps, troop positions marked with colored pins, and supply line charts that stretched across the surface like the circulatory system of an empire laid bare. The table had a crack running through its center, fresh, the wood splintered and pale at the breakpoint. One of the chairs was overturned. Kaylor stood at the far wall, staring at a map of the 7 territories pinned to a corkboard. His hands were braced against the wall on either side of the map, arms locked, shoulders rigid, the posture of a man holding himself up through architecture rather than strength. The tremor in his left hand was worse than she had ever seen it. His knuckles were scraped raw. Blood had dried in thin lines across his fingers where the skin had split against wood. He did not turn when she entered. Sarah stood 10 feet behind him and said nothing. She let the silence do what silence does in moments like this, create space for the truth to surface without being chased. 30 years, Kaylor said finally. His voice was lower than usual, rougher, the gravel quality ground down to something closer to crushed glass. Aldrich Vale stood in this room. He advised my father. He advised me. He held my border while I put down the Draven Rebellion. He carried my seal. He ate at my table. Sarah waited. And he signed a challenge letter with ink that was probably dry before I finished dinner last night. Loyalty built on proximity to power dies the moment the power looks vulnerable. That is not a defect in people. That is just the math of survival. He turned his head. Not all the way, just enough to catch her in his peripheral vision. The angle of his jaw was so tight she could see the muscle working beneath the skin like a cable under tension. You think this is math? I think the part of you that is furious right now is the part that trusted him. And the part that needs to survive this is the part that reads the board and moves. Those two parts of you cannot operate at the same time. One of them has to go quiet. And which one do you recommend? The one that keeps you breathing. He pushed off the wall, turned fully. The light from the narrow window caught the dried blood on his knuckles, and the dark hollows under his eyes, and the scar below his ear that seemed deeper in this light, a groove carved into the geography of a man who had been taking hits longer than most people had been alive. The challenge requires a public review at the spring assembly, 3 months. If the council votes to remove me, every territory in the Dominion reverts to independent governance. The alliances collapse. The military fractures along territorial lines, civil war within 6 months. Then we have 3 months to make sure the vote fails. The vote is already decided. Aldrich has 5 members. He needs 5. He has them. He has them today. 3 months is a long time to hold a coalition together when the people in it are motivated by ambition rather than principle. Ambitious people are loyal to outcomes, not to each other. Find the weakest link and apply pressure. Kaelor stared at her. The rage was still there, banked behind his eyes like coals pushed to the back of a furnace, but something else was surfacing alongside it. The same thing she had seen in the throne room on their first meeting. Recognition. The look of a man who has been speaking a language no one else understands and suddenly hears someone answer in the same tongue. Lady Marin Drock, he said. The Eastern Reach representative. Hargrave says she is either complicit or compromised. If she is compromised, that means someone is holding leverage over her. Find the leverage. Remove it. Her vote flips. And if she is complicit? Then we find what she wants more than what Aldrich is offering. Everyone has a price. You taught me that the day I arrived. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The memory of one. The next 6 days were the longest of Sarah's life. She worked from the archive during the day and the war room at night, building a case that mapped the full scope of Aldrich Vale's conspiracy. The picture that emerged was worse than she had imagined. The diverted military funds were just the surface. Beneath it lay a network of compromised officials, bribed harbor masters, and redirected weapons shipments that stretched across 4 territories. Aldrich had not been preparing a political challenge. He had been preparing an infrastructure for regime change, a machine designed to take power and hold it regardless of whether the council vote succeeded or not. The vote was a formality, a legal cover for what was coming regardless. She brought the analysis to Kaelor on the 7th night. He read it in silence, page by page, while Sarah sat across the war room table and watched the last traces of disbelief drain from his face like water from a cracked vessel. He has been building this since before I purchased the contract, Kaelor said. At least 18 months, probably longer. The shell companies were established 2 years ago. He started positioning before the curse showed visible symptoms, which means he has a source inside the medical staff. Or inside your inner circle. The implication landed like a slap. Kaelor looked up from the papers. His eyes were flat and cold and absolutely still, the eyes of a predator processing a threat. You're suggesting someone close to me is feeding intelligence to Vale. I am saying the timeline does not work unless someone with direct knowledge of your medical condition communicated that information to an outside party. The shell companies predate any public sign of the curse. Someone told him you were weakening before the world could see it. The silence in the war room was total. No wind, no fire crackle. Just the sound of a king's breathing as he absorbed the realization that the betrayal was not just political, it was intimate. Someone he trusted with the most dangerous secret in the Dominion had weaponized it and handed the blade to the man now holding it against his throat. Kaelor stood. He walked to the window. His left hand was shaking badly now, the tremor running up his forearm in visible waves. He pressed it against the cold glass and held it there, and Sarah understood that the cold helped. The curse was cold. But external cold numbed the tremor the way you press ice against a burn, not healing it, just silencing the scream long enough to think. 3 people know the full extent of my condition, he said, without turning. My physician, Hargrave, and now you. Then one of those 3 is lying. Hargrave has been with me since I took the throne. He would sooner cut his own hands off. Loyalty does not make someone immune to leverage. Everyone has a vulnerability, a debt, a family member in the wrong territory, a secret they cannot afford to have surfaced. You suspect Hargrave. I suspect everyone. That is how you stay alive when the walls are closing. Kalor pressed his forehead against the glass. His breath fogged the window in slow, even pulses. Outside, the harbor lights reflected on black water, and the wind carried snow sideways through the dark. My physician, he said quietly. Dr. Alara Venn. She has served the royal household for 12 years. She is the only person who has full access to my medical records, my treatment protocols, my blood work. Where is she from originally? The Eastern Reach. The words fell through the room like stones dropped into a well. The Eastern Reach. Lady Maren Drock's territory, Aldrich Vale's strongest ally on the council. The same territory bleeding revenue through shell companies connected to Greymore Holdings. I need access to her personal correspondence, Sarah said. That would require a royal warrant. Then issue one. If I issue a warrant against my own physician based on the suspicion of my contracted mate who has been in this palace for 10 days, every remaining loyalist on the council will question my judgment. And if you do not, the woman who may be feeding your medical secrets to the man trying to take your throne continues to operate with full access to your body and your blood, and every weakness the curse has carved into you. Kalor pulled his head from the glass. He turned slowly. The weariness on his face had deepened into something harder, something that went beyond exhaustion into the territory of grim reckoning, the expression of a man who understands that the next decision he makes will cost him something precious, no matter which direction he chooses. There is another option, he said, one that does not require a warrant. I am listening. The Winter Conclave, 12 days from now. Every territorial lord, every council member, every major house convenes at the palace for 3 days of negotiation and alliance renewal. It is the single event where every player is in the same room at the same time. You want to use it as a trap. I want to use it as a stage. If Aldrich has built a conspiracy, he has built it through relationships, promises made in private, debts exchanged in shadow. The Conclave forces those relationships into the light. People who conspire in letters behave differently when they are standing 3 feet apart in a room full of witnesses. You want me to watch them. I want you to read them. The way you read the ledgers. The way you read me on the first day. I want you in every room, at every dinner, at every private meeting you can access, and I want you to tell me who flinches. Sarah felt the architecture of his plan settle over her like a second skin. He was not asking her to spy. He was asking her to do the thing she had been doing since she was old enough to understand that the world her father navigated was made of hidden currents and submerged rocks. Read the room, find the cracks, map the fractures before the building falls. The conclave is in 12 days, she said. Yes. And the challenge vote is in 3 months. Yes. That gives us 12 days to identify the leak, 12 days to find Maren Drock's vulnerability, and 12 days to build a counter-strategy before every enemy in the Dominion walks through those gates and sits at your table and smiles at you while they sharpen their knives. That is the situation. Then we have work to do. She stood, crossed to the door, and stopped. Kalor? He looked at her. The curse, the tremor, the cold. How bad does it get during stress? His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the scar. Bad. Define bad. During the last territorial crisis, I lost feeling in my left arm for 6 hours. My core temperature dropped to a point where the physicians induced external warming to prevent cardiac arrest. Sarah absorbed that. She let it settle into the place where she kept the facts that were too dangerous to feel and too important to forget. The conclave will be the most stressful 3 days of your reign. Every enemy you have will be watching for exactly the kind of episode you just described. If the curse strikes during the conclave in front of witnesses, the challenge becomes irrelevant. They will not need a vote. They will have proof. I know? Then you need to tell me how to help you, not as a contracted mate, not as a political asset, as the person who will be standing next to you when the cold comes. I need to know the signs, the thresholds, the protocols, everything. Why? Because you have spent 14 years managing this alone and it is killing you. And I did not survive my stepmother and an auction house and 3 days in a frozen carriage to watch you collapse in front of the wolves. Because you were too proud to let someone hold the wall while you caught your breath. The war room was silent. The maps on the table showed an empire stretched across 7 territories, borders drawn in ink, power measured in pins and lines, and the distances between things. But the real map of the Dominion was in this room, in the space between a dying king and a woman who had been sold for $80,000, standing on opposite sides of a cracked table, deciding whether to trust each other with the truth that could destroy them both. Kaelor reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather journal. He set it on the table. The cover was worn soft from years of handling, the edges frayed, the binding cracked. Inside were pages of tight, angular handwriting, medical notes, dates and temperatures and dosages, a 14-year record of a man documenting his own deterioration with the clinical precision of someone who has made peace with watching himself die. "Everything is in there," he said. Sarah picked up the journal. It was warm from his body. She held it against her chest and felt its weight, not the physical weight, but the weight of what it represented. 14 years of silence, 14 years of carrying this alone. And now he was handing it to a woman he had known for 10 days because the alternative was handing it to no one and dying with the secret still locked inside. She nodded once, turned, left the room. And in the corridor outside, pressed flat against the cold stone wall where the shadows were deepest, Dr. Alara Venn stood with her breath held and her hands trembling and a look on her face that was equal parts terror and the specific agony of a woman who has just realized that every move she makes from this moment forward will determine whether she lives or dies. She had heard everything, and now she had to choose. The king she had betrayed, or the man who held the chain around her throat. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. Her fingers shook as she turned it in the torchlight. The label read in neat clinical script, a compound name Sarah would have recognized instantly if she had seen it, because it was not a treatment. It was the thing accelerating the curse. Alara closed her fist around the vial and disappeared into the dark. The winter conclave opened under a sky the color of bruised iron. 340 delegates from all 7 territories converged on Vesper Crown in a procession of armored carriages, mounted escorts, and banner-bearing columns that stretched from the harbor gates to the palace steps, like a serpent swallowing itself. The flags of every major house snapped in the frozen wind, Draven black, Moran silver, Vale green and gold. And above them all, from every tower and battlement, the Iron Wolf banners of the Voss dynasty hung like warnings nailed to the walls. Sarah watched the arrival from the east wing window, Kaelor's medical journal open on the table behind her. She had memorized every entry over the past 11 days. 14 years of data reduced to a single devastating trajectory. Core temperature declining at a rate of 0.3 degrees per year. Motor function degradation accelerating after year 10. Cardiac episodes increasing in frequency from once a year to once a month. The pharmaceutical protocols growing more aggressive as their effectiveness diminished, higher doses yielding shorter windows of stability, the body adapting to the chemicals the way a prisoner adapts to chains, not by escaping but by learning to function within smaller and smaller margins of movement. But the numbers did not match. That was the thing gnawing at the back of Sarah's mind like a rat chewing through rope. The rate of decline recorded in the journal showed a pattern that was too consistent, too linear, too predictable. Biological deterioration does not follow straight lines. It follows curves. It accelerates and plateaus and stalls and surges. The human body fights. It compensates. It reroutes. The fact that Kaelor's decline tracked so cleanly against a linear projection meant one of two things. Either the frost curse behaved unlike any biological process known to medicine, or something was interfering with his body's natural ability to compensate. Something external. Something administered. She had not told Kaelor yet. She needed proof. She needed the vial she did not know existed, sitting in the coat pocket of a physician who was somewhere in this palace right now, deciding whose side of history she wanted to stand on. The opening ceremony of the conclave took place in the grand hall at midday. Every seat was occupied, every wall lined with standing observers. The noise was enormous, a rolling wave of voices and shuffling bodies, and the clink of ceremonial weapons that the territorial lords were permitted to wear as a symbol of sovereignty. The air smelled of cold wool, melted candle wax, and the acrid edge of political tension that manifests in rooms where powerful people gather to pretend they are not already at war. Kaelor entered last. That was tradition. The Alpha King arrives after every other house is seated, a demonstration of hierarchy so deeply encoded in the Dominion's rituals that even his enemies stood when he appeared. He wore the formal black of the Voss line, unadorned except for the iron wolf clasp at his throat. No crown. Kaelor had never worn the crown. He considered it an affectation, a performance for people who needed symbols because they could not sense the real thing. Sarah walked 2 steps behind him. That was the protocol Hargrave had briefed her on. The contracted mate enters in the king's wake, visible but secondary, present but not presiding. She wore the dark silk the palace had provided, the wolf thread at her sleeves, and an expression she had spent 30 minutes constructing in the mirror that morning, neutral, watchful, the face of a woman who has already decided that everything she sees today is evidence. They took their seats on the raised platform, Kaelor to the center, Sarah to his left, Hargrave to his right. Below them, 340 delegates arranged by territory, a map of the empire rendered in human bodies and house colors. Sarah's eyes found Aldrich Vale immediately. 3rd row, center section, green and gold. He sat with the stillness of a man who has already won and is simply watching the ceremony play out because form demands it. His daughter, Renara, was 2 seats behind him, her auburn hair catching the candlelight, her face composed in that same porcelain mask she had worn in Sarah's quarters on the first day. Beside Aldrich sat Lady Maren Drach, Eastern Reach, the 5th vote. She was smaller than Sarah expected, thin and sharp-featured, with the nervous energy of a woman carrying too many secrets in a body not built for the weight. Her fingers moved constantly, adjusting her sleeves, touching her collar, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. She was afraid. You did not need to be a student of human behavior to see it. You just needed eyes. The ceremony proceeded. Territorial reports, trade summaries, military readiness updates delivered by commanders who spoke in the clipped, factual cadence of men trained to report carnage with the emotional register of weather forecasts. Sarah listened to all of it, but her attention was divided. Half her mind processed the information. The other half watched the room the way her father had taught her, not for what people said, but for what they did while other people were talking. Aldrich Vale never looked at the king. Not once. In a room built around the throne, that absence was louder than a shout. Maren Drach looked at Aldrich 4 times in the first hour. Each time she looked, her right hand went to her collar. A tell. She was checking for reassurance from the man holding her leash, and the gesture at her throat was unconscious, a phantom reach for a change she could feel even when it was not visible. Renara Vale watched Sarah, steadily, without blinking, the way a cat watches a bird through glass. The first day ended without incident. That was the point. The conclave's opening day was designed as a display of unity. The cracks would come later, in the private meetings and corridor negotiations that happened between the formal sessions, where the real power moved like groundwater beneath a frozen surface. That night, Sarah went to work. She attended the territorial reception in the South Hall, moving through clusters of delegates with a glass of wine she never drank, listening. She positioned herself near groups where Eastern Reach representatives gathered. She noted who spoke to whom, the volume and duration of conversations, the way bodies angled toward or away from certain people. She cataloged 17 separate interactions that suggested prearranged coordination between House Vale loyalists and at least 3 previously neutral territorial representatives. The conspiracy was larger than they knew. She found Hargrave at midnight in his office and delivered the assessment in flat clinical terms, while he took notes with a hand that grew progressively more unsteady as the scope of the intelligence became clear. "He has been recruiting beyond the council," Sarah said. "This is not a 5-vote challenge. This is a full territorial coalition. He is building a bloc large enough to not just remove Kaelor, but to restructure the Dominion itself, independent governance for the territories with a rotating chancellorship replacing the monarchy. That would end the Voss dynasty." "That is the point." Hargrave set his pen down. "We need to accelerate. The conclave runs 3 more days. If we wait for the spring assembly, we will be fighting a war that was lost before it started." "I agree. Which means we need the 5th vote, Maren Drach. Tonight I saw her check her collar 9 times. She is being controlled. Someone has leverage on her that goes beyond political ambition. What kind of leverage? The kind that makes a woman touch her own throat when she is afraid. That is not political anxiety. That is personal. Someone is threatening something she cannot afford to lose. Family? Find out, now, tonight. Whatever resources you have, use them. Hargrave looked at her with an expression Sarah had seen only once before, on her father's face, the night he realized the woman he married was dismantling everything he had built. It was the look of a man watching someone become the thing the situation requires, not because they wanted to, but because no one else in the room was going to do it. "You have changed," he said. "I have not changed. I have just stopped pretending this is a situation where hesitation is an option." The second day of the conclave broke something open. During the territorial sovereignty session, a minor lord from the Northern Reach stood and delivered what appeared to be a routine trade complaint. But the language was wrong. The phrasing was too precise, the legal citations too specific. Sarah recognized the structure immediately. It was a test, a carefully constructed provocation designed to force the king into a public response that could be measured for weakness. Kaelor handled it. Barely. His response was sharp, authoritative, the voice of a man who had been shutting down challenges since before most of the delegates in the room had inherited their titles. But Sarah was close enough to see the cost. His left hand gripped the arm of his chair so hard the wood creaked. Sweat formed along his hairline despite the cold. The tremor ran up his forearm in a wave that he masked by leaning forward as if in emphasis. He was spending reserves he did not have. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that changed everything. She went to find Dr. Elora Venn. The physician's quarters were in the medical wing on the second floor, a suite of rooms that smelled of alcohol and dried herbs, and the particular sterile loneliness of spaces where people come only when something is wrong. Sarah found the door unlocked. The rooms were neat, organized with the obsessive precision of a woman who controlled her environment because she could not control her circumstances. Elora was not there, but her correspondence was. Sarah did not have a royal warrant. She did not have authorization. She had instinct and 11 days of pattern recognition and the cold certainty that if she waited for proper channels, the proper channels would arrive too late to matter. She searched the desk. Medical files, treatment logs, supply requisitions, all immaculate, all perfectly in order, which was itself a red flag, because perfect order is what you create when you know someone might eventually look. The drawer was locked. Sarah picked it with a hairpin her mother had given her when she was 16, a skill her father had taught her in the study one rainy afternoon, laughing while he explained that a lord's daughter should know how to open anything, because closed doors were just questions nobody had bothered to ask yet. Inside the drawer, she found 3 things: a sealed letter addressed to a post office box in the Eastern Reach, a ledger of payments received from an account registered to Graymore Holdings, and a glass vial filled with clear liquid, labeled in clinical shorthand that Sarah did not recognize but understood with a gut-level clarity that made her vision narrow and her hands go cold. She held the vial up to the light, clear, odorless. Designed to be undetectable in the pharmaceutical cocktail administered to the king 3 times daily. Not a treatment, a catalyst, something engineered to accelerate the very condition it was supposed to manage. Elora Venn had not been treating the frost curse. She had been feeding it. The door opened behind her. Elora stood in the threshold. She was pale, thin, her hands clasped in front of her in a posture so similar to the way Sarah had stood in that auction house on Graymarsh Street that the parallel hit like a physical blow. 2 women, both trapped, both controlled by forces larger than themselves. The difference was that Sarah had signed her name on a contract. Elora had signed hers on a conspiracy. "My daughter," Elora said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She is 7 years old. She lives with my sister in the Eastern Reach. Lord Vale's men visited them 6 months ago. They did not threaten. They did not need to. They simply let my sister know that they knew where the girl went to school, what time she walked home, which window was her bedroom." Sarah held the vial steady. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands did not shake. She would not allow them to shake. Not now. "How long have you been administering this?" 14 months. The compound is designed to mimic the natural progression of the curse. No test would catch it. No physician would question it. The decline looks organic. You have been killing him. I have been keeping my daughter alive. Alara's voice cracked on the last word. Her composure fractured, and beneath it, Sarah saw something she recognized from her own mirror. The face of a woman who has been carrying an impossible weight and has reached the precise point where the body can no longer hold the shape the mind demands. If I stop administering the compound, Vale will know within days. His people monitor the king's medical reports. They will see the change in the decline pattern, and they will understand that I have been compromised. And then my daughter dies. Sarah's mind ran calculations with the speed and coldness of a machine built to process exactly this kind of impossible equation. The vial in her hand was proof of treason. It was also proof that Aldrich Vale's conspiracy extended into the most intimate space of the king's life, his own bloodstream. The implications were staggering. Every military analysis, every political calculation, every assessment of the king's remaining time was based on a rate of decline that had been artificially accelerated, which meant Kaelor was stronger than anyone knew, which meant the curse was more manageable than anyone believed, which meant the entire premise of the leadership challenge was built on manufactured evidence. If I bring this to the king, Vale's conspiracy unravels. The challenge loses its foundation. The conclave becomes the stage for exposing the entire operation. And my daughter dies before the first word is spoken. Not if we get to her first. Alara looked up. Hope is a dangerous thing in the eyes of a woman who has stopped believing in it. It does not arrive gently. It arrives like a blade, cutting through scar tissue to reach nerve endings that had gone dormant. And the pain of feeling again is almost worse than the numbness that preceded it. How? Hargrave has intelligence assets in every territory. The Eastern Reach is no exception. If we move tonight, we can have your daughter and your sister extracted before dawn. Vale's people will not know until it is too late because they will be here. At the conclave. In this palace. Where every move they make is being watched. You would do that. I would do what needs to be done. That is all anyone can do when the options run out. Sarah pocketed the vial. She took the letter and the ledger. She looked at Alara Ven and saw a woman standing at the edge of the same cliff she herself had stood on in that auction house. The cliff where you choose between the person you have been and the person the situation demands you become. Come with me, Sarah said. Right now, we go to Hargrave, we go to the king, and you tell them everything. He will have me executed. He will have you answer for what you have done. What happens after that depends on what you do in the next 60 seconds. Alara closed her eyes. Her hands trembled. The corridor outside was silent, the palace holding its breath the way buildings do when history is about to pivot inside their walls. She opened her eyes. Take me to the king. They found Kaelor in the war room. He was standing at the map wall, alone, his left hand pressed flat against the northern reach, as if he could feel the territory's pulse through the paper. The tremor was bad tonight. His breathing was shallow. The conclave was draining him faster than the protocols could compensate, and for the first time Sarah could see the math clearly. The precise intersection of political stress and physical decline that Aldrich Vale had calculated with the patience of a man who understood that empires do not fall in a single blow, but in the accumulation of 1,000 small wounds administered over time. Kaelor, Sarah said. He turned. He saw Sarah. He saw Alara. He saw the vial in Sarah's hand and the ledger under her arm and the expression on her face that was beyond anger, beyond strategy, beyond everything except the raw, stripped-down clarity of a woman who has found the knife in the wound and is about to pull it out regardless of how much blood follows. Sit down, Sarah said. Tell me. Sit down first. He sat. Not because she commanded it, because something in her voice told him that what was coming would require a man to be anchored to something solid. Sarah placed the vial on the table between them, then the ledger, then the letter. 3 objects arranged in a line like evidence at a tribunal, which is exactly what they were. Your physician has been administering a compound designed to accelerate the frost curse for the past 14 months. The compound was provided through channels connected to Greymore Holdings, which is controlled by Aldrich Vale. Your rate of decline is artificial. The premise of the leadership challenge is manufactured, and the man who has been sitting in your council chambers for 30 years has been killing you 1 dose at a time while preparing the political infrastructure to replace your dynasty with a system that puts him at the center of power. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the sound of a man's entire understanding of his own life restructuring itself in real time. Every diagnosis, every worsening symptom, every night spent documenting his own deterioration in that leather journal. Every moment of private despair when the cold crept deeper and the tremor grew worse, and the mirror showed a man aging faster than the years could account for. All of it reframed, all of it rewritten, not the slow, inevitable march of a curse he was born to carry, but a weapon, wielded by a hand he had trusted. Kaelor looked at Alara. The physician stood 3 feet from the table, her arms wrapped around herself, her body shaking with the particular violence of a woman who has finally set down a weight she has been carrying for 14 months and now feels every ounce of it in the absence. "My daughter," Alara said. Her voice was raw. "He has my daughter." Kaelor's eyes moved from Alara to Sarah, to the vial, back to Sarah. "You are certain?" The compound accelerates the neurological effects of the curse by degrading the body's compensatory mechanisms. Without it, your natural resilience would have slowed the decline significantly. You are stronger than anyone in this palace believes, including you. Something moved through Kaelor's body then. Sarah watched it happen. It started in his chest, a deepening of breath, an expansion, as if his lungs had been operating at half capacity and someone had just removed the band compressing them. It moved through his shoulders, his spine, his hands. The tremor in his left hand did not stop, but something beneath it changed, a current of heat moving under ice, not enough to break the surface, but enough to shift the pressure underneath. He was recalibrating, not just his understanding of his condition, his understanding of himself. For 14 months he had believed his body was surrendering. Now he knew it had been under siege. And there is a vast, critical difference between a man who believes he is failing and a man who knows he has been sabotaged. The first one prepares to die. The second one prepares for war. Kaelor stood. The chair scraped back against the stone floor. He was taller than Sarah remembered. Not physically, something else. Something that lived in the way he held his weight and the set of his jaw and the glacial clarity that poured into his eyes like meltwater, filling a channel that had been dry for years. "Hargrave," he said. One word. The command in it could have moved walls. Sarah had already sent for him. Hargrave appeared in the doorway within minutes, his face draining of color as he took in the scene, Alara shaking by the wall, the vial on the table, the look on his king's face. "Extract Dr. Ven's daughter and sister from the Eastern Reach. Tonight. Use the ghost unit. No territorial channels, no local assets, direct extraction, safe house in the Northern Reach until I say otherwise. Kaelor, if Vale's people detect the operation, they will not. Because by the time the extraction is complete, Aldrich Vale will be standing in the Grand Hall at the Conclave's closing ceremony, surrounded by every delegate in the Dominion, and I will be standing in front of him holding the evidence of his treason, while 300 witnesses watch the most powerful lord in the Empire learn what it costs to put a knife in the king's blood." Hargrave looked at Sarah. She nodded once. He left. Kaelor turned to Alara. The physician flinched. Whatever she expected to see in the king's eyes, mercy was not it. And what she found there was something more complicated than mercy, but also more dangerous. The expression of a man who understands that the person standing before him is both weapon and wound, both enemy and evidence, and the only way to use one without destroying the other is precision of a kind that most men never learn. "You will remain in this room under guard until the extraction is confirmed. Then you will testify, publicly, before the full conclave. They will kill my daughter. Your daughter will be safe before you speak. You have my word. The word of a king I helped poison. The word of a king who is still standing despite what you did. That should tell you something about the value of my word." Alara's knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the table, her fingernails scraping the wood, her breath coming in sharp gasps that sounded like they were being torn from her chest by hand. She did not cry. She was past crying. She was in the territory beyond tears where the body has exhausted every expression of anguish and can only manifest it through trembling and the wild, cornered look of an animal that has finally stopped running. Sarah took her by the arm and guided her to a chair. She did not say comforting words because there were no comforting words for what Ilara Ven was living through. There was only the presence of another human being who understood what it felt like to be used as a tool by people with more power and fewer scruples. And sometimes presence is the only honest thing you can offer someone whose world has just come apart. The night moved fast after that. Hargrave's ghost unit departed within the hour, 6 operatives on horseback moving through the mountain pass that cut the travel time to the eastern reach by 2/3. Sarah monitored the operation from the war room using the palace's signal relay network. A system of coded lantern messages passed between watchtower stations along the territorial borders. It was crude. It was slow. It was also untraceable by anyone who did not know the specific code sequences, and Hargrave had changed the codes 3 hours ago. Kaylor did not sleep. He sat at the war room table with the vial in front of him and his medical journal open beside it, rewriting his own history page by page. Every entry, every temperature reading, every episode of cardiac distress, all of it recalculated against the new variable, the compound, the artificial accelerant, the poison administered by a woman whose hands he had trusted with his veins. Sarah watched him work. She saw the moment the new math resolved in his mind, the slight lift of his head, the slow exhale, the way his shoulders settled into a different alignment. He had been carrying the weight of a death sentence. Now he was carrying the weight of a betrayal. The second was heavier in some ways, but it came with something the first did not: rage. And rage, unlike despair, has a direction. The closing ceremony is tomorrow afternoon, Kaylor said without looking up. 340 delegates. Full assembly. Open floor. Aldrich will expect a routine closing. Standard diplomatic language. Treaty renewals. Aldrich will get a trial. You need the extraction confirmed first. I know. And you need to survive the morning sessions without the compound withdrawal triggering a visible episode. Your body has been receiving the accelerant for 14 months. Removing it suddenly may cause unpredictable physiological responses. I know that too. Then you know that tomorrow is the most dangerous day of your life. He looked up, the slate-gray eyes, the scar, the exhaustion that had lived in his face for as long as she had known him, that was still there, still real, but now it shared space with something else. A heat. A low, steady furnace of will that had been burning beneath the ice all along, waiting for something to burn through. Come here, he said. Sarah did not move, not from resistance, from the sudden awareness that the space between them had changed, that crossing it now meant crossing into a territory neither of them had mapped, a place where the contract ended and whatever this was between them began. She crossed it anyway. She stood beside his chair. He reached up and took her hand. His fingers were cold, the frost curse still living in his bones, but beneath the cold something pulsed, faint, warm, a rhythm that was not entirely his heartbeat and not entirely hers, but something between them, fragile and new, and so quiet you could only hear it in the absence of everything else. The mate bond. Not ignited, not fully formed, but there, present. A thread of warmth in the vast, cold architecture of a dying king's body, reaching toward the only source of heat it had ever recognized. Whatever happens tomorrow, Kaylor said, you walk out of that hall alive, no matter what. That is not a request. You do not get to decide who survives. Not anymore. That is not how this works. How does it work? We walk in together, we fight together, we walk out together. Or we do not walk out at all. His hand tightened around hers. The tremor was still there, but it was different now. Not the tremor of a body failing, the tremor of a body gathering. Dawn came gray and savage over the harbor. The signal came with it. Hargrave burst into the war room at 6:14 with frost on his coat and a piece of decoded parchment in his hand. His face was drawn tight, the skin around his eyes creased with the particular intensity of a man who has been awake for 30 hours and is running on nothing but adrenaline and duty. Extraction confirmed. The girl and her aunt are in the Northern Reach safe house. Ghost unit is holding position. Kaylor stood. Then it is time. The grand hall filled for the closing ceremony under the weight of 340 witnesses and a sky that had gone the color of hammered lead. The delegates took their seats in territorial blocks, a mosaic of house colors and political allegiance rendered in wool and silk and the hard set of human faces. The air was thick with the smell of burning torch oil, and the electric anticipation of people who could feel the pressure changing but did not yet know from which direction the storm was coming. Aldrich Vale sat in his usual position. Third row, center, green and gold. His face was composed. His hands were still. The posture of a man who believed he was watching the final act of a play he had written. Renara sat behind him, porcelain mask in place. Maren Drock sat to Aldrich's left, her fingers moving at her collar in that tell Sarah had mapped days ago. The ceremony began. Protocol demanded opening remarks from the territorial representatives, trade summaries, alliance renewals, the machinery of empire grinding through its rituals. Kaelor sat on the raised platform and let it proceed. His left hand rested on the arm of his chair. The tremor was visible if you knew where to look. Sweat traced a line down his temple despite the cold. The withdrawal from the compound was hitting him in waves, each one pulling heat from his extremities and sending microspasms through his musculature that he masked with stillness the way a wounded animal masks pain with absolute immobility. Sarah sat to his left. Her hand rested on the arm of her own chair, 4 inches from his. Close enough to reach if the cold took him. Close enough to anchor. The territorial reports concluded. The protocol called for the king's closing address. 340 faces turned toward the platform. 340 pairs of eyes fixed on the man who held the Dominion together by force of will and the stubborn refusal to die on anyone else's schedule. Kaelor stood. The tremor in his hand surged. His vision narrowed. The cold hit him like a wave crashing through his chest, freezing the air in his lungs, turning his blood to slush. And for one terrible moment his left knee buckled, and the entire hall saw the king of the Iron Wolf Dominion stagger. A gasp moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Aldrich Vale leaned forward in his seat, the first real expression Sarah had ever seen on his face. Not triumph exactly. Satisfaction. The deep, quiet satisfaction of a man watching a plan he has spent years building arrive at its final, inevitable conclusion. Then Sarah stood. She did not wait for protocol. She did not wait for permission. She rose from her chair and stepped forward to the edge of the platform, and 340 delegates looked up at the woman they had spent the entire conclave dismissing as furniture and found someone else entirely standing in her place. "Members of the conclave," she said. Her voice carried to the back wall, clear, steady, the voice of a woman who has nothing left to lose and has discovered that nothing left to lose is the most dangerous currency in any empire. Before the king delivers his address, there is a matter of evidence that must be presented to this body. Aldrich Vale's hands moved for the first time, a small adjustment, a shift in his chair, the first fracture in 30 years of composure. Sarah reached into her coat and withdrew the vial. She held it up to the torchlight so the entire hall could see it, clear liquid catching the flame. Evidence small enough to fit in a palm, powerful enough to bring down a dynasty. This compound has been administered to the king for 14 months by a member of his own medical staff, acting under duress and under the direct instruction of a lord sitting in this hall. It is not a treatment. It is a catalyst designed to accelerate the frost curse and manufacture the appearance of physical decline severe enough to justify a leadership challenge. The silence in the grand hall was absolute. 340 people stopped breathing at the same time. And in the third row center section, Lord Aldrich Vale looked at Sarah Calloway with eyes that had finally, after 30 years of perfect control, gone wide. Behind Sarah, Kaelor rose to his full height. The tremor in his hand stopped. The vial caught the torchlight, and 340 people saw their empire change shape in the space between one breath and the next. Sarah held it steady. Her arm did not waver. Her voice did not crack. She had spent 23 years learning how to stand in rooms full of people who wanted her to sit down, and this was the room that mattered, and she was done sitting. "The physician who administered this compound is prepared to testify," Sarah continued. "The financial records linking the compound's procurement to Greymore Holdings, a shell entity controlled by House Vale, are in the possession of the king's senior advisor. And the military supply funds diverted over the past 18 months to build an armed coalition capable of enforcing a regime change have been fully documented and cross-referenced with territorial shipping manifests." She paused. Let the silence do its work. 340 faces processing the architecture of a conspiracy that had been built beneath their feet while they attended banquets and signed trade agreements and slept in their fine territorial beds, believing the empire was simply aging the way empires age. The leadership challenge filed under Article 19 is not a legal remedy. It is the political front for a coup designed to replace the Voss monarchy with a rotating chancellorship controlled by the very lord who orchestrated the king's poisoning. Sarah turned and looked directly at Aldrich Vale. "Lord Vale, would you care to address this body?" The grand hall held its breath. Aldrich Vale sat in his chair for 4 seconds. Sarah counted. 4 seconds of absolute stillness while the most disciplined political mind in the Dominion calculated every remaining option with the speed of a man who has spent 30 years running scenarios for exactly this kind of moment. His face showed nothing, his hands showed nothing, but his eyes moved. Once, to the left, toward the doors. He was measuring the distance to the exit. Then he stood, slowly, with the unhurried precision of a man who understands that how you stand in a crisis determines how history remembers you. "These are extraordinary allegations," he said. His voice was steady, controlled. The voice of a man who has not yet accepted that control is no longer his, brought by a woman who has been in this palace for less than a month. A contracted mate with no political standing, no territorial authority, and no legal right to address this body. "She speaks with the authority of the crown," Kaelor said. Every head turned. The king stood at the front of the platform, his full height, his full breadth. The tremor in his left hand was gone, not suppressed, not masked, but genuinely absent for the first time in months. The withdrawal from the compound was still grinding through his system. Sarah could see it in the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead and the way his jaw was set against pain that lived somewhere deep in his bones. But the body that had been told for 14 months that it was dying had just received a different message. It had been under siege. And bodies under siege, once they understand what is happening, do not surrender. They mobilize. "Sarah Calloway speaks with the full authority of the Iron Wolf crown," Kaelor repeated. "Every word she has spoken is verified by evidence currently held in the palace vault. Every document has been authenticated, and the physician who administered the compound is prepared to give sworn testimony before this body." He stepped to the edge of the platform and looked down at Aldrich Vale with the eyes of a man who has just learned that the most intimate betrayal of his life was also the most calculated, and who has chosen to respond not with rage, but with the thing that is worse than rage for a man like Aldrich Vale. Clarity. "You had 30 years, Aldrich, 30 years at my side. You could have come to me. You could have challenged me openly. You could have stood in this hall like a man and said the words to my face. Instead, you put poison in my blood and waited for the cold to finish what you started." Aldrich's composure cracked, not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories where the villain crumbles and confesses and the audience gets the satisfaction of watching power collapse in real time. It cracked the way real composure cracks, in the small places, the corners of the mouth, the tendons in the neck, the almost imperceptible shift in posture that tells you the skeleton beneath the performance has just recognized that the ground it is standing on is no longer solid. "You were dying," Aldrich said. His voice carried, but the edge was different now, thinner. "The curse was taking you. Everyone in this room could see it. A king who cannot hold his own hand steady cannot hold 7 territories. I did what the Dominion required." "You did what your ambition required. The Dominion did not ask for a chancellor, you did. And what has your monarchy given us? 14 years of a king with no mate, no heir, no succession plan, ruling through force because he cannot rule through legacy. The Voss bloodline ends with you, Kaelor. I was building what comes after." "You were building a throne for yourself out of my bones." The words landed in the hall like stones dropped from a great height. Every delegate felt the impact. The vibration of it moved through the room in concentric circles, rippling outward from the 2 men at the center, the king and the lord, the sovereign and the traitor, standing 10 feet apart in a space charged with the accumulated weight of 30 years of trust and 18 months of calculated destruction. Aldrich looked at the faces around him, searching for allies, searching for the coalition he had spent years assembling in shadow. But coalitions built on secret promises and manufactured crises have a particular weakness. They are held together by the belief that the plan will succeed. The moment that belief fractures, every member of the coalition becomes an individual calculating their own survival, and individual survival in the presence of an angry king looks very different from collective ambition in the safety of a locked room. Maren Drock was the first to break. She stood from her seat, her face white, her hands no longer touching her collar because the chain she had been wearing for months had just been cut. The extraction of Alara Ven's daughter meant the leverage was gone. The fear was gone. And without fear, Maren Drock was just a woman who had been trapped in the same machine that had trapped the physician, and she wanted out. "I withdraw my support for the leadership challenge," she said. Her voice shook, but it carried. "And I am prepared to provide testimony regarding the recruitment methods used by Lord Vale to secure my cooperation." The coalition cracked like ice calving from a glacier. 2 more council members stood within seconds, distancing themselves with the desperate speed of people who understand that proximity to a falling man is measured in career-ending increments. Then a 4th, then the 5th. Aldrich Vale stood alone. 30 years of political architecture, 18 months of meticulous conspiracy, networks spanning 4 territories, shell companies, diverted funds, a poisoned king, and a manufactured crisis designed to reshape the oldest surviving monarchy on the continent. All of it undone by a woman who read trade journals and a physician whose daughter slept safely tonight in a house beyond the reach of the men who had used her as a chain. The palace guard moved on Kaelor's signal. 4 men in iron-gray uniforms, their faces professional and empty, the faces of men who enforce the will of the crown without commentary because commentary is not in the job description. They flanked Aldrich Vale on both sides. He did not resist. He stood with his hands at his sides and his chin level, and the last remnants of his composure held in place by nothing but habit and the stubborn refusal to let the final image of his public life be one of collapse. Renara rose from her seat behind her father. The porcelain mask was gone. What remained beneath it was something Sarah had not expected. Not rage, not defiance. Grief. The grief of a woman watching the man who raised her revealed as something other than what she had believed, or perhaps the grief of a woman who had always known and had chosen the architecture of denial over the demolition of truth. And now the demolition was happening in public, and there was nowhere left to hide. "Lady Vale," Kaelor said. His voice was quieter now. The authority was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, a recognition that the woman standing before him was collateral damage in a war she had not designed. "Your father's crimes are his own. Your titles and holdings remain under review pending investigation. You are free to leave the capital." Renara looked at the king, then at Sarah, and in that look, Sarah saw something pass between them that would never be spoken aloud but would be understood by both women for the rest of their lives. The acknowledgement of what could have been. A different version of this story, where Renara stood where Sarah stood, and the empire ran on different rails toward a different future. But that version required a Renara who did not exist. One who had questioned her father's machinery instead of climbing inside it, and the distance between the woman she was and the woman she would have needed to be was the distance between a palace and a ruin. Renara turned and walked out of the grand hall. Her footsteps echoed on the stone. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke. The doors closed behind her. The conclave erupted into controlled chaos. Council members demanding investigations, territorial lords calling for emergency protocols, military commanders requesting authorization to secure the compromised supply chains, the machinery of an empire absorbing a shock and reorganizing itself around the new reality the way a body reorganizes around a wound, not by pretending the wound does not exist, but by redirecting resources to the places that need them most. Kaelor managed it. Not with the iron-fisted control he had wielded for 14 years. The control of a man holding everything together through sheer force of will because he had no other option. He managed it with something different: delegation, trust, the willingness to let other hands carry pieces of the weight while he directed the overall structure. It was a small shift, almost invisible, but Sarah saw it, and she understood that what she was watching was a man learning in real time that the thing he had feared most, needing other people, was not weakness. It was the only architecture that could sustain the weight he had been carrying alone. The formal proceedings concluded at dusk. The challenge was dissolved. The compromised council members were placed under investigation. Aldrich Vale was escorted to the palace detention wing to await tribunal. The diverted military funds were frozen. The shell companies were seized. And somewhere in the northern reach, a 7-year-old girl slept in a warm bed with her aunt beside her and no men in the shadows outside her window. Sarah stood on the east battlements that night and watched the harbor lights burn against the black water. The wind was still cold, still sharp enough to cut, but it felt different now. Not hostile, just wind. The element doing what elements do, moving through the world without agenda, shaping the things it touches not through malice, but through persistence. Footsteps behind her. She did not turn. She knew the weight of those steps by now. The particular cadence of a tall man walking stone corridors, favoring his right side less than he had a month ago. Kaylor stood beside her at the parapet, close enough that the sleeve of his coat brushed her arm. The contact was small, incidental, and it sent a current of warmth through the cold air between them that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the thing that had been growing in the space where a contract used to be. Alara Venn has been transferred to protective custody, he said. Full immunity in exchange for complete testimony. Her daughter is being brought to the capital. Good. The council voted unanimously to dissolve the challenge and open a formal investigation into every entity connected to Greymore Holdings. It will take months, maybe years, but the structure is compromised beyond repair. Also good. And the physicians have run new projections based on the removal of the compound. The natural rate of decline is roughly 60% slower than the accelerated trajectory. The curse is still present. It will always be present. But the timeline is different. Years, not months. Sarah said nothing. She let the information settle the way important information needs to settle, not in the mind, which processes facts, but in the body, which processes what facts mean for the future you had stopped believing in. The mate bond, Kaylor said. He turned his head toward her. The scar below his ear caught the harbor light. My physicians believe it has begun to form. The warmth I felt in the grand hall when you stood beside me. The stabilization of the tremor. The reduction in cold episodes over the past week. They are consistent with an early-stage bond formation. Is that the medical assessment, or are you telling me something? I am telling you that the woman I purchased for $80,000 saved my life. Exposed the deepest conspiracy in the history of the Dominion, restructured my understanding of my own body, and apparently generated a biological response that my bloodline has been waiting 14 years to produce. And I am standing on this battlement trying to find the right words for that. And I am failing because the right words do not exist in any language I speak. Sarah turned to face him. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and she did not push it back because pushing it back would require releasing the edge of the parapet, and she was not sure her knees were entirely reliable at the moment. I did not do any of that for the contract, she said. I know. And I did not do it because of the bond. I know that too. I did it because you were honest with me. In a room full of people performing power, you were the only one who told me the truth, even when the truth was ugly and inconvenient and made you look weak. You told me I was an investment. You told me the court would try to destroy me. You handed me your medical journal, 14 years of your worst fears written in your own hand, and you trusted me with it. Not because you had to, because you chose to. She paused. The wind filled the silence. That is why I stayed. Not the money, not the bond, not the empire, you. The man underneath the crown who was brave enough to be honest when honesty could have cost him everything. Kaylor reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warmer than they had been a month ago. Not warm the way healthy hands are warm, but warm the way hands are warm when something inside has started to thaw, slowly, unevenly, the way ice retreats from a landscape in spring, leaving behind ground that is raw and exposed and not yet ready for anything but still, for the first time in a long time, capable of growing something. The contract expires in 22 months, he said. I know. When it expires, you walk away free. Full settlement, debts cleared. The Callaway estate restored under your name. Everything I promised. I know. And if you choose to stay after that, it will not be because of a piece of paper. It will be because you decided to. Is that a proposal? That is a man standing in the cold telling a woman that the most important decision of his life should be entirely hers. Sarah looked at him, the slate gray eyes, the scar. The jaw that had been clenched against pain for so long the muscles had forgotten any other shape. And beneath all of it, showing through the cracks, the way light shows through the cracks in a wall that has been standing in darkness, something human and imperfect and stubbornly, defiantly alive. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said the thing that was truer than either. Ask me in 22 months. The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it was not the ghost of a smile. It was the real thing. Small, rough, unpracticed. The smile of a man who has forgotten the mechanics and is learning them again from scratch. I will. They stood on the battlements and watched the harbor. The ships rocked at anchor. The city climbed the cliffs in its staggered rows of black stone. The palace rose behind them, enormous and ancient and scarred with the history of every king who had ever stood where they were standing now, looking out at an empire that demanded everything and gave nothing back except the privilege of holding it together for one more day. But tonight the empire was quieter. The conspiracy had been exposed. The poison had been stopped. The coalition had crumbled. And in the cold, dark heart of Vesper Crown, something had shifted that no political analysis or military assessment could quantify. A king who had been dying was not dying anymore, or at least not as fast, and the woman standing beside him was not furniture or a contract or a transaction, but something the empire had not seen in 14 years. A partner. Not a word that appeared in treaties or territorial charters. Not a word that carried legal weight in the halls of the Great Council, but a word that carried weight in the space between two people who had been broken by the world and had somehow, against every odd and expectation and calculation, found in each other the one thing neither had been looking for. Someone who stayed. Spring came to the Dominion the way spring comes to places that have been frozen for a long time. Not gently, not gradually, but with a violence of color and warmth that felt almost aggressive after months of gray, as if the season itself was angry about being kept waiting and intended to make up for lost time by overwhelming everything it touched. The harbor ice cracked and calved into the sea. The cliffs showed green where frozen moss revived. Trade ships returned to the port in increasing numbers, their hulls riding lower with goods, the economic pulse of the empire resuming its rhythm after a winter that had nearly stopped it forever. Sarah watched the thaw from the window of the palace library, where she now spent most of her mornings reviewing intelligence briefings with Hargrave, and most of her afternoons restructuring the territorial oversight systems that Aldrich Vale's conspiracy had corrupted. The work was enormous. The damage ran deeper than the financial record showed, into the trust between territories, into the morale of the military, into the fundamental belief of the people that the institutions protecting them were not compromised from within. Rebuilding that trust was slower than exposing the conspiracy had been, slower and harder, and less dramatic. There would be no single moment of revelation, no vial held up to torchlight, no grand hall full of witnesses gasping in unison. There would only be the daily, grinding, unglamorous work of demonstrating through action that the crown meant what it said, that the reforms were real, that the oversight was genuine, that the people who had been failed by the system would not be failed by it again. Sarah did that work, not because the contract required it, not because the bond demanded it, because it was the work that needed doing, and she was the person who could do it, and there was a particular kind of freedom in discovering that your skills and your purpose had finally landed in the same place. The Callaway estate was restored in late spring. A formal decree bearing the royal seal transferring the property and all associated holdings back to Sarah's name, clearing all debts, honoring the legacy of Lord Callaway as a man whose service to his house and his territory had been betrayed by those closest to him. Sarah read the decree in the library and felt something move in her chest that she had kept locked away for so long she had almost forgotten its shape. Her father's name. Clean again. Standing on its own legs in the public record, no longer crushed beneath the weight of manufactured ruin and a stepmother's calculated greed, she folded the decree and placed it in the desk drawer beside her mother's locket. Two objects, two anchors to a life that existed before Vesper Crown, before the contract, before the Obsidian Palace, and the frozen harbor, and the man with the scar below his ear who had changed the direction of everything. She did not cry, but she sat for a long time in the quiet of the library, her hands flat on the desk, her breathing slow, and she let herself feel the full, unfiltered weight of what it meant to survive something that should have destroyed her and come out the other side, not just intact but transformed. That is the thing they never tell you about survival. It does not leave you the same. It cannot. The person who walks out of the fire is not the person who walked in. Something burns away and something else hardens, and the shape that remains is not the shape you chose, but the shape the fire made. And learning to live inside that new shape is its own kind of courage, quieter than the kind that faces down conspiracies in grand halls, but no less real. Months passed. The bond deepened. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical intensity of legend. It deepened the way real things deepen, through proximity and honesty and the accumulated weight of small moments that do not announce themselves as important, but turn out, in retrospect, to be the foundation everything else was built on. A hand offered across a table during a difficult briefing, a shared silence on the battlements when the weight of governance pressed too hard for words. The way Kaylor started leaving the war room door open when he knew she was working late. Not an invitation, just an opening, a space held for someone whose presence had become part of the architecture of how he functioned. The tremor in his left hand faded, not entirely. The frost curse was part of him, woven into the Voss bloodline like a thread in a tapestry, and it would never fully release its grip. But the bond held it back the way a wall holds back water, not by eliminating the force, but by giving it a boundary, and the boundary held because it was built from something stronger than chemistry or contract. It was built from choice, renewed daily, without ceremony, without audience. The quiet, stubborn, unglamorous decision of two people to keep showing up for each other in a world that had given both of them every reason to stop showing up for anything. On a night in late autumn, almost a year after Sarah had signed her name on a table in a jaundiced room on Graymarsh Street, snow returned to Vesper Crown. The first flakes fell in the early evening, small and dry, catching the lamplight as they drifted past the palace windows like signals from a season that had once been Sarah's enemy and was now simply the weather. She stood at the window of the quarters she still technically occupied alone, although the distance between technically and actually had been shrinking for months, in ways that neither she nor Kaylor discussed directly, because some things are better honored by action than by language. He found her there, the way he always found her, without announcement, without ceremony. A tall man in a dark corridor, his footsteps steady, his breathing even, his left hand still at his side. "It is snowing," she said. "It snows here 8 months of the year. You have mentioned it before. I have mentioned that it is cold. The snow itself I do not mind. The snow is honest. It falls. It covers things. It melts. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. You are describing water. I am describing the only element in this empire that does not have a political agenda." He stood beside her. Their reflections overlapped in the dark window glass, two shapes merging at the edges, not perfectly, not seamlessly, but in the way that real things merge, with gaps and imperfections, and the visible evidence of two separate histories pressing against each other and finding, against all probability, that the pressure holds. "The Council ratified the reforms today," he said. "Unanimous. Territorial oversight, financial transparency, independent audit authority. Everything you designed. Everything we designed. You drew the blueprints. I signed the paper. That is called partnership, Kaylor." "Is that what we are calling it?" "That is what it is." He was quiet for a moment. The snow fell. The harbor lights burned. Somewhere below, the city carried on with the business of living, the 1,000 small transactions of survival and commerce and human connection that constitute the actual substance of an empire, the substance that exists beneath the banners and the thrones and the grand halls, in the kitchens and the workshops and the harbor docks where people carry things for each other, because carrying things alone is possible, but carrying them together is how you build something that lasts. 12 months remain on the contract, he said. "I know. I said I would ask you in 22 months. You did. I am not asking yet. I know. But I want you to know that when I ask, The answer matters to me in ways I do not have sufficient language to describe, and that the man asking will not be the man who signed that contract. He will be someone different, someone you built, or someone you made possible. I have not decided which word is more accurate. Sarah turned from the window. She looked at him, the scar, the jaw, the eyes that had been winter slate when she met him and were something else now, still gray, still sharp, but with depth where there had been only surface, like ice that has thawed enough to show the water moving underneath. You did not need building, she said. You needed someone to stop the people who were tearing you down. Those are different things. Are they? Yes. One of them assumes you were broken. The other assumes you were under siege. I never thought you were broken, Kaylor. I thought you were the strongest man I had ever met in the worst circumstances I had ever seen, and the fact that you are still standing after everything that was done to you is not because of me. It is because of you. I just held the wall while you caught your breath. His hand found hers. Warm, steady, the tremor absent, the cold at bay, the bond humming between them in a frequency that did not require acknowledgement, because it was woven into every breath and every heartbeat and every moment of shared silence that had accumulated over the past year, like snow accumulating on a landscape, changing the shape of everything without any single flake being responsible for the transformation. He raised her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. She felt it beating, strong, even, the heart of a man who had been told he was dying and had refused, not through denial, through the harder thing, through choosing to live in the face of evidence that said living was not an option, and trusting that the evidence was wrong, and holding on long enough for a woman with cracked shoes and a dead father's stubbornness to walk into his frozen palace and prove it. Thank you, he said. 2 words. That was all. But they carried the weight of 14 years of silence and 18 months of poison and 11 months of grief and 1 year of learning that the most powerful thing in any empire is not the army or the treasury or the throne, but the willingness of one human being to stand beside another when standing alone would have been easier. Sarah pressed her hand harder against his chest, felt the warmth, felt the heartbeat, felt the bond singing its quiet, stubborn song beneath the skin of a king who had been forged in cold and saved by fire. You are welcome, she said. The snow fell on Vesper Crown. The palace stood dark against the white sky. The harbor rolled beneath its burden of ice and salt water, and the accumulated history of an empire that had nearly destroyed itself from within and was now, slowly, imperfectly, painfully, learning to be something better than what it had been. Inside the palace, the lamps burned low. The corridors were quiet. The throne room was empty and the war room was dark, and the maps on the tables showed territories that were, for the first time in years, genuinely at peace. And in a room overlooking the harbor, a king and the woman who saved him stood together at the window, watching the snow fall on their kingdom, saying nothing, because the silence between people who truly know each other is not empty. It is full.